This month, we received a lot of news about Pokemon Sword and Shield for the Switch after hearing virtually nothing since the games were first revealed a few months ago. This will be the first proper main series Pokemon game on the Switch that takes place in a brand new region of a new generation, and lots of Pokemon fans are very excited for this brand new adventure. We learned a lot of great positive things about Pokemon Sword and Shield this month, starting with the Pokemon Direct in early June, but this all took a turn for the worst following Nintendo's E3 conference a week later, where we learned that some Pokemon will not be obtainable in Pokemon Sword and Shield, and you would not even be able to transfer over those Pokemon to Sword and Shield using Pokemon Home, which is essentially Pokemon's new version of Pokemon Bank. This, of course, is not a good thing. People have every right to be upset about the lack of a National Dex, since collecting all of these Pokemon has been a staple since the Pokemon series since the beginning, and transferring over all these Pokemon from older games makes it a lot easier to catch them all, which after all is the game's slogan. This led to a lot of other conversations talking about how the game will be bad, all from this one scenario of missing the National Dex. Prior to us learning about the lack of a National Dex, however, the reception of the game was overwhelmingly positive, and people only started to look for reasons to dislike the game after we learned the news about the National Dex. I feel like this is a case of confirmation biases where people have an idea about something and then try to find other reasons to support that idea due to their initial bias. In this case, people think Sword and Shield will be bad due to the lack of the National Dex, and then keep looking for other reasons to dislike the game and bring it down due to this one thing they do not like. I'm personally not a fan of the lack of the National Dex at all either. I've made a video about how I dislike this change in the past, but I do think that this whole thing has been blown out of proportion a little bit as time went on. One of the first things people attacked about Sword and Shield after we learned about the lack of the National Dex and the lack of transferable Pokemon was the sprites. This was never a problem before we learned about the lack of the National Dex, but all of a sudden people are saying the sprites look bad and that they are reused 3DS models from the 3DS Pokemon games after we learned about the lack of the National Dex. This of course is just blatantly false, as it was proven that these sprites are brand new and not just copy and paste over from a 3DS games, which is not exactly possible by the way, as the 3DS runs on an entirely different system, on an entirely different resolution than the Switch, but that's besides the point. These new sprites of course though do look similar to the old sprites, which they should since they are based on the same Pokemon after all. Just like how Mario looks very similar in Mario Galaxy 2 for the Wii than he does in Mario Odyssey on the Switch, as they are still the same character. They're of course going to look similar, one is just going to be slightly updated, have a higher resolution, and just look a little bit better. Pokemon has also never been a game to focus on these improved hyper-realistic graphics, and I don't really think that they should. People are also very quick to compare Pokemon Sword and Shield's graphics to the graphics of a game like The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, as the graphics in Zelda are far superior. This is expected as the two are entirely different games with entirely different developers, one of which is a developer primarily focused on making home console games in Zelda, and the other is just coming off of making a ton of handheld games in Game Freak. But again, this graphics debate only became an issue after we learned about the lack of the National Dex. And the fact of the matter is, Pokemon games have never really been like this, and people never really complained about the graphics, at least not nearly as much as they are now. If we take a look at the DS Pokemon games, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl up into Black and White 2, these games are all in a 2D style for the most part, while other DS games like Animal Crossing featured a full 3D world and look more like a 3DS Pokemon game than a DS Pokemon game, despite Animal Crossing Wild World predating every single main series Pokemon game on the DS by at least a year. People didn't complain about it then, so I don't really understand why it's as much of an issue now. The graphics in Sword and Shield as a whole are a step up from the 3DS games, however, which is nice, as those games' resolution are only set to 240p, while the Switch should be at least 1080p. These games will look better, and although it might not look as good as other games on the system, this was never an issue in the past, and Pokemon games have never been the best looking game on their respective systems, so I don't really see why that's an issue now. Maybe that's just my personal opinion, as the thing that I value the most when playing through a game is just the actual game if I enjoy playing through it, rather than the graphics of the story, but I guess everyone's entitled to their own opinion, and some people put graphics a lot higher than others, even though in my opinion I think it's one of the least important aspects of a video game. People then began to attack Pokemon Sword and Shield based on the animations in the game, especially for certain attacks, which once again wasn't a problem until after we learned about the lack of the National Dex. a lot of the animations in this game for attacks aren't very good either. A lot are very similar to older animations. However, we do now have better idle animations for Pokemon, which does look a little bit better. This was most prominently shown on the starter Pokemon Sobble, and I think it is a nice welcome addition. The unfortunate thing about these animations though, is the inclusion of these animations was cited as one of the reasons for removing older Pokemon from the game, making the animations an easy target for Pokemon fans to be upset about. I personally don't know the truth to this. I'm sure these animations take up a nice chunk of space since they are higher resolution than other Pokemon games, but it still seems a little bit off to me that these animations were the reason why so many Pokemon were being omitted. This is one of the few legit criticisms I see stemming from the whole National Dex controversy, since these animations were directly cited for the lack of a National Dex, and these animations don't really seem that amazing to warrant omitting Pokemon rather than the animations. I feel like most of us would have rather had things similar to the older animations and had all the Pokemon in the game, but I guess we'll never know. And the last thing I see a lot of people talking about is how Sword and Shield seem like an unfinished game due to these omitted Pokemon, which I don't fully understand and I don't agree with at all. The games will still feature a full story with plenty of old and new Pokemon to catch along your journey, and much like any other Pokemon game before it, you will not be able to obtain or transfer over all these Pokemon before completing the game anyway, and that's the key here, completing the game. And that's what confuses me the most. People are complaining about this game being unfinished because after you complete the game, you can't transfer over your Pokemon. That just doesn't make a lot of sense. The Pokemon series has always been held to a high standard of having post-game content or some other activities to do like this after you beat the full proper game, and although I personally do not like the omission of the National Dex either, I hardly think that this would make Sword and Shield unfinished. People are also very quick to forget the fact that this is all pre-game footage that we saw before the game fully released. It is entirely possible that the game will get a slight graphical enhancement once the game is actually released, just like we saw with Mario Odyssey a few years ago. If you guys remember, the pre-game footage and the demo footage for Mario Odyssey didn't really look all that fantastic, and then once the game actually came out, it looked way better. I'm not saying it's confirmed that will be the case for Sword and Shield, but it's still entirely a possibility, and I don't think it's fair to shame a game's graphics when we don't even have the full game released yet. One of the bigger complaints about the lack of the National Dex that I think is directly affected would be competitive battling. Obviously, with the lack of some Pokemon, that'll limit the competitive pool of some Pokemon you can use, which I think is a big issue. Now, this doesn't seem like it'll be as big of an issue for VGC, as VGC typically has some sort of limited dex, at least for the first year, and assuming we get another main series Pokemon game in 2020, it shouldn't really be an issue at all for VGC, but the biggest issue that this has is for Smogon singles 6v6 battles. Smogon is notorious for allowing a lot of Pokemon, unlike in VGC, having various different tiers depending on how much they are used. If some of these Pokemon are omitted, then that creates some problems. This is also the case in draft leagues, which sort of stems off of Smogon a little bit, which is basically a lot of people getting together and drafting Pokemon much like they would in a fantasy football draft, and then battling them week by week to see who is victorious at the very end. Since the pool of Pokemon will be severely limited by the lack of the National Dex, that should take it to draft leagues, which is quite unfortunate as I participated in a lot of draft leagues in the past. One of the ways they have tried to solve similar issues to this in the past was the whole system of having a different shape in the bottom corner of a Pokemon to signify which game it was from. I think it would have made a lot more sense to continue this trend of having the shapes, but instead they just decided to just not include a lot of these Pokemon. Another valid criticism I see for this game stemming from the whole National Dex controversy is the lack of Z-moves and Mega Evolutions in Sword and Shield. At first, when I heard about this, I thought this was a mistranslation or just some sort of flat-out mistake, but apparently there will be no Mega Evolution at all and no Z-moves in Pokemon Sword and Shield. This is rather unfortunate again for competitive battling for a lot of obvious reasons, but it is something that's very disappointing to see, as Mega Evolutions were a huge part of Gen 6. I personally love Mega Evolutions, and then Z-moves were a huge part of Generation 7, and to just have those be essentially erased for Generation 8 doesn't make a lot of sense. It makes me wonder if Dynamax, the new gimmick so to say for Sword and Shield, will be continued into the next generation, or if it'll just be scrapped right after Sword and Shield. This National Dex controversy has been blown up so much, I've even seen people saying they're looking to get into other similar franchises to Pokemon due to this, most namely Yokai Watch. Now, I personally love the Yokai Watch franchise, and I think anybody should at least give it a chance as it's amazing, but there is a huge issue with switching over to Yokai Watch from Pokemon because you're upset about the lack of older Pokemon being in this new Pokemon game. First off, Yokai Watch isn't exactly in a good state, especially outside of Japan. It has decreased in popularity severely. The most recent game, Yokai Watch 4, has been pushed back and delayed a lot. I believe the day this video comes out might actually be the day that Yokai Watch 4 comes out even. And we might not even get it released in English. There are also older yokai that are unobtainable in new Yokai Watch games as well, just like how it is in Sword and Shield. However, that has always been the case for Yokai Watch. Now, I'm not trying to say that this makes the lack of the National Dex in Pokemon okay since other similar games do it, but it's weird to me to switch to a new franchise because you dislike something they've done when this new franchise is doing that exact thing that you disliked in the first place. Now, the key difference here is Pokemon has never omitted older Pokemon, while in other games that's the norm. I personally hope that in the future we do get more of these older Pokemon obtainable in Pokemon Sword and Shield through free DLC, as if they made this pay DLC, that'll be a whole other controversy, which I think will be pretty terrible, or at least in the upgraded version of Sword and Shield, whatever it'll be called, Sword and Shield 2 or whatever, assuming we get that game or some game similar to it in the next year or possibly in the year following, which includes the ability to transfer over all of the older Pokemon and adds the National Dex back into it, since I think it's safe to say that the vast majority of Pokemon fans would prefer to have the National Dex than not having a National Dex. In the end, I am still a little upset with the lack of the National Dex, but this has gone a little bit too far. Don't let this one negative change affect your view on the entire franchise, which for most of us has been one of our favorite franchises for many years and hasn't really let us down too much in the past. I'm still confident that Sword and Shield will be a great game, as I've enjoyed every single main series Pokemon game I've played in the past, and although the lack of this National Dex is disappointing, everything else in the game looks promising, and I still think this is a very exciting time to be a Pokemon fan.